house on Harper Street. It was the summer of 2010 when my friend, Tom, called me with an unusual favor. He asked if I could house sit for him and take care of his 2 cats while he was undergoing some medical treatment for about a month. I didn't think twice and agreed immediately. I had known Tom for years, and he was one of those friends you would do anything for. Little did I know, my decision would lead me to an experience that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The house he owned was an old Victorian-style building located on the edge of town. It had a peculiar aura to it, one that I couldn't quite place when I first stepped through the door. Tom gave me a quick tour of the place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of heaviness in the air. It wasn't until we reached the basement that I began to feel truly uneasy. "Here's the basement," Tom said, his voice sounding a little off. He paused at the top of the stairs, a look of hesitation crossing his face. "I don't usually go down there much, but if you need anything stored or whatever." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the chill that ran through me. The stairs creaked under my feet as I glanced down the dark corridor, the air damp and cold. Something about the basement unsettled me, so I decided to avoid it for the time being. We moved on to the upstairs bedroom, where Tom had set aside a small guest room for me. As he showed me the room, I felt a strange sensation tugging at the back of my mind. The bed was perfectly made, and the small window looked out over the garden. But there was a faint smell in the air, something musty and stale. I couldn't explain it, but I decided to brush it off. Tom seemed eager to get going, so I promised to take good care of his cats, and he left shortly after, heading to the hospital for his treatment. After Tom's departure, I started settling in. I unpacked my bags, rearranged a few things in the guest room, and made sure the cats were comfortable. But that evening, as I was going through some of my belongings in the spare room, the cats acted strange. Both of them, one gray tabby and the other a sleek black cat, rushed into the room, their fur standing on end. They ran underneath the bed, huddling together. I could hear them hissing softly, their bodies tense. It was as if they were terrified of something, confused and a little worried. I bent down to peer under the bed, but there was nothing there, just dust and forgotten items. I stood up, brushing off the weirdness. When my eyes shifted to the living room, I froze. There, across the hardwood floor, in the slant of sunlight coming through the window, were the legs of a man. They were just legs, nothing more. The person was walking slowly, with heavy, deliberate steps. His pants were worn, stained with grease, and his boots looked old, like something a mechanic might wear. I didn't hear any other movement, no creaking of the floor or rustling, just the legs, walking toward the front door. I couldn't move. My mind raced as I processed what I was seeing. Was I hallucinating? The cats were still underneath the bed, their hisses growing louder. I slowly backed away, not taking my eyes off the spot where the legs had been, and shut the door to my room. I didn't leave that room for a long time, despite what I had seen. I didn't feel like I was dealing with a traditional ghost or spirit. It wasn't a presence that I recognized from the ghost stories I'd heard over the years. No cold winds, no eerie sounds, just a palpable sense of dread that hung in the air. Felt like something had been there, but was now gone. Something dark, something that made my skin crawl. And yet, I couldn't explain why I felt it so strongly. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. When Tom returned a month later, I couldn't help but bring up the strange incident. We sat down over coffee, and I recounted everything that had happened during his absence. The look on his face when I mentioned the legs in the living room was one I would never forget. "You saw them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. his face drained of color. He shifted uneasily in his seat. "I knew you would. You're not the first." I stared at him, unsure if I had heard him right. "What do you mean? What's going on here, Tom?" He hesitated before continuing, his voice barely audible. I didn't tell you everything. When I moved into this house, there were strange things that started happening. First, it was just little things misplaced, odd noises at night. But then I started seeing things I couldn't explain. The basement, I don't go down there anymore. I leaned forward, eager to hear more. "What about the room? My guest room?" I asked, hoping he might shed light on the unease I had felt. He hesitated again. "When I first moved in, I found strange markings on the walls. Lines, symbols, things that didn't make sense. I painted over them, but I should have taken pictures. I should have kept proof." I shivered at his words. The feeling of dread I had experienced was suddenly more real than ever. Something in that house was wrong. Something that went beyond the strange happenings I had seen. The marks on the wall, the legs walking toward the door, it was all connected. Tom's story left me unsettled. I pressed him for more details, but he seemed hesitant, almost as though speaking about it would give it more power. He eventually relented and told me that, shortly after he moved in, he started noticing a presence in the house. It was subtle at first, cold drafts in the middle of summer, faint footsteps in the hallway at night, and the sound of something or someone moving in the basement. He had tried to brush it off, blaming his imagination, but things escalated quickly. One night, Tom said, his voice trembling slightly, I woke up to the sound of heavy boots walking through the hallway. I thought it was a burglar, so I grabbed the baseball bat I keep under my bed. But when I opened my door, there was no one there, just the sound of footsteps moving away, toward the basement. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I went downstairs, but the basement door was locked. I checked every corner of the house, but there was no one. That was the first time I realized, whatever this is, it's not human. I felt a chill run down my spine. And the markings on the walls? I asked, leaning in. Tom nodded. They were everywhere when I moved in. Symbols, strange phrases in a language I didn't recognize. Some of them looked like they were scratched into the walls. Others painted in what looked like red ink. I painted over them the first chance I got. But I think it made things worse. I couldn't help but glance toward the basement door, which was visible from where we sat in the kitchen. It loomed there, dark and foreboding, as though it was waiting for us to acknowledge it. That night, couldn't sleep. Tom had gone to bed, but I stayed up, pacing the living room and trying to make sense of everything he had told me. The cats were curled up on the couch, seemingly unbothered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, I heard it, the sound of footsteps coming from the basement. They were slow and deliberate, the heavy thud of boots against the wooden stairs. My heart raced as I stood frozen in the living room. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped at the top of the basement stairs. I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open, but nothing happened. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and crept toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I turned it and pulled the door open. The basement was pitch black, the air cold and damp. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light caught glimpses of old furniture, cardboard boxes, and what looked like a rusted tool chest. But there was something else, something on the walls. I descended the stairs cautiously, my breath fogging in the icy air. As I reached the bottom, the flashlight illuminated the walls, and my stomach turned. The symbols Tom had mentioned were still there, faint but visible beneath the layers of paint. They looked ancient, like something out of an occult textbook. Strange spirals, jagged lines, and crude drawings of human figures filled the walls, their eyes hollow and their mouths open in silent screams. In the center of the room, I noticed something else, a large, circular symbol etched into the concrete floor. It was filled with the same markings as the walls, but this one looked freshly carved. I crouched down, running my fingers over the grooves, and realized they were stained dark red. I didn't want to think about what had been used to make them. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, the beam dimmed, then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the flashlight, shaking it in a desperate attempt to get it working again. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the corner of the basement. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until I felt a rush of cold air pass by me. I scrambled to my feet and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely lock the door. The next day, I confronted Tom. "There's something in your basement," I said, my voice trembling. "Something dangerous." He looked at me with tired eyes, as though he already knew what I was going to say. "I think it's time I told you the truth," he said, motioning for me to sit down. Tom explained that the house had a dark history. It had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Henry Carver, a local mechanic who was rumored to dabble in the occult. According to town records, Carver was obsessed with summoning spirits and spent years conducting rituals in the basement. Neighbors reported strange noises and lights coming from the house at all hours of the night, but no one dared confront him. In 1893, Carver disappeared without a trace. When authorities searched the house, they found bloodstains on the basement floor and strange symbols carved into the walls, but no sign of Carver himself. Over the years, the house passed through several owners, but none stayed for long. Everyone who lived there reported strange occurrences: footsteps, voices, and shadowy figures lurking in the corners. "I thought I could handle it," Tom said, his voice breaking. "But whatever Carver summoned, it's still here, determined to put an end to whatever was haunting the house." I convinced Tom to help me investigate the basement one last time. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a notebook filled with research on the symbols, we descended the stairs together. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the silence. As we stood in the center of the room, the temperature dropped suddenly, our breath visible in the freezing air. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly, pulsating with an eerie light. Then, without warning, the carved circle on the floor began to emit a low hum. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and contorting as it stepped into the dim light. It was tall and humanoid, but its face was featureless, save for two glowing red eyes. The presence was suffocating, an overwhelming sense of dread washing over us. Tom shouted something, his voice barely audible over the deafening hum. He grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the stairs, but the entity blocked our path. Desperation took over as I reached for the notebook, flipping to a page with a cleansing ritual I had found during my research. Chanting the words, I felt a surge of energy course through the room. The entity shrieked, its form dissolving into wisps of black smoke. The temperature slowly returned to normal, and the oppressive feeling lifted. But the markings on the walls remained, a haunting reminder of what had transpired. Tom sold the house a few months later, unable to live with the memories of what we had faced. I still think about that night, wondering if we truly banished the entity or if it's still lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. One thing is certain, I'll never set foot in that house again. The haunting of Willow Creek. When I first moved out of my old house on Willow Creek Lane, I thought I was leaving behind a strange chapter of my life. It had been a week since my family packed up and left that house for good, seeking a fresh start in a new town. But the memories of the bizarre and terrifying events that took place within those walls still lingered, haunting my thoughts like an unwelcome shadow. Now, as I sit here trying to make sense of it all, I find myself compelled to share my story, not for sympathy, but in the hopes that someone out there might have answers to the questions that continue to plague me. Our old home was a modest two-story house, tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It wasn't particularly old or unusual in appearance, but there was something about it that felt wrong. My parents had divorced when I was 12, and my father, Robert, had stayed in the house while my mother moved to a different state. I split my time between the two, but it was during my stays with my father that the strangeness began to reveal itself. It started small. I had a bedside lamp in my room that seemed to have a mind of its own. No matter how many times I turned it off, it would always flick back on, often in the middle of the night. First, I chalked it up to faulty wiring or an electrical issue. But the behavior of that lamp defied logic. My dad replaced it twice, but the same thing happened with every new lamp we tried. Then there was the alarm clock. Whenever I wasn't at the house, the clock in my room would go off at random times throughout the day. It didn't matter if the alarm was set or not. My dad would find it blaring at full volume, and he'd have to manually turn it off. He joked that the house missed me when I wasn't there, but I could tell he was unnerved. He started avoiding my room altogether. The incidents escalated one winter night when I was 14. I woke up shivering, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. My blanket had slipped to the floor, so I reached over to grab it, but something made me stop. There, in the middle of my room, stood a figure. It was translucent, barely more than a shimmer in the moonlight streaming through the window, but its shape was unmistakable. It was a man, tall and lean, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was pale, his features indistinct, but his eyes were like empty voids, staring straight at me. I froze, too terrified to move or even breathe. The figure didn't speak or move. It just stood there, his presence overwhelming and suffocating. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at it, before I finally mustered the courage to pull the blanket over my head. I stayed like that until morning, too scared to come out. The following night, it happened again. This time, I woke up to find the figure sitting on the edge of my bed. The mattress dipped slightly under its weight, and I could feel the cold radiating from its form. It didn't do anything, just sat there, staring at the wall. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. Instead, I curled up under the blanket and prayed for it to go away. When I told my dad about what I had seen, he looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief. "It's just your imagination," he said. "Maybe a bad dream, but I knew it was real." The fear I felt wasn't something that could be dismissed so easily. As time went on, other strange things began happening. Doors would open and close on their own. Even when they were locked, objects would move from one place to another, as if unseen hands were rearranging them. My dad started hearing noises in the middle of the night. Footsteps, whispers, the faint sound of someone humming a tune. One particularly disturbing incident happened in the living room. My dad and I were watching TV when the curtains suddenly began to sway, as if caught in a breeze. But there were no windows open, and the air was still. Then, the pull cords on the ceiling fan began to swing back and forth, colliding with each other with soft, rhythmic taps. We both sat there, frozen, until the movement stopped as abruptly as it had started. A year later, we finally moved out. My dad sold the house to a young couple, Emma and David, who seemed thrilled to find a place in such a quiet neighborhood. We didn't tell them about the strange occurrences. How could we? They probably wouldn't have believed us anyway. But less than a week after they moved in, Emma called my dad. Her voice was shaky, almost frantic, as she described what had been happening. She said that every night, the curtains in the living room would sway back and forth, and the pull cords on the fan would swing wildly. Even when the fan was off, doors they had locked before bed would be wide open in the morning. One night, Emma woke up to the feeling of fingers running through her hair. She thought it was David, but when she turned over, he was sound asleep on the other side of the bed. Another night, she felt the mattress shift, as if someone had sat down beside her. But when she opened her eyes, there was no one there. Emma and David's experiences mirrored my own so closely that it was almost as if the house itself had a personality, a restless, malevolent presence that thrived on fear. I couldn't help but wonder if the ghostly figure I had seen was responsible for all of it. Who was he? What did he want? And why had he chosen that house? In an attempt to find answers, I started researching the history of the house. What I discovered was chilling. The property had once belonged to a man named Samuel Harrington, a reclusive inventor who had lived there in the late 1800s. According to old newspaper articles, Samuel had died under mysterious circumstances. His body was found in the basement, surrounded by strange symbols etched into the walls. Some locals believed he had been experimenting with the occult, trying to open a gateway to the spirit world. Driven by curiosity and a sense of responsibility, I decided to visit Emma and David. I shared what I had learned about Samuel Harrington, and they agreed to let me conduct a small investigation. Armed with a flashlight, a voice recorder, and a notebook, I ventured into the basement. The air was thick and oppressive, the faint smell of mildew mingling with something metallic. I shone the flashlight on the walls, and my heart skipped a beat. The symbols were still there, faint but visible under layers of peeling paint. I traced my fingers over them, feeling an unnatural coldness seep into my skin. As I set up the voice recorder, a sudden chill swept through the room. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. "Is anyone here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The silence that followed was deafening, but when I played back the recording later, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, low and distorted, whispered, "Leave." To this day, I don't know what haunted that house on Willow Creek Lane. Emma and David moved out shortly after my visit, unable to endure the growing intensity of the phenomena. The house remains vacant now, a silent reminder of the secrets it holds. And as for me, I still dream about the man in the long coat, his empty eyes staring into mine. Some nights, I wake up shivering, half expecting to see him standing at the foot of my bed. If you're reading this and have any idea what I experienced, I'm listening, because the fear never truly leaves. It just waits, lingering in the shadows, ready to return. The haunting of Blackwood Manor, in the quiet countryside of Vermont, just outside the small town of Black Hollow. my husband, Daniel, and I stumbled upon an abandoned Victorian-era house known as Blackwood Manor. The house, sitting on 5 acres of dense woodland, had been vacant for decades, its history long forgotten by the locals. The deal was almost too good to be true, despite its eerie reputation. The price was unbelievably low. We had poured every last cent into purchasing and renovating the house. We didn't know much about its past, only that it had been uninhabited for years. But from the moment we stepped onto the property, something felt off. As we began the restoration process, the workers frequently complained about feeling watched. Tools would disappear, only to reappear inside locked rooms. What disturbed me the most was the unnatural silence. Despite being surrounded by thick forest, there was not a single bird, squirrel, or even an insect. It was as if the land itself had been abandoned by nature. The most peculiar thing was the sealed-off staircase leading to the second floor. A massive wooden door, reinforced with heavy iron locks, blocked the way. It made no sense. Who would go through such lengths to keep people out of a part of their own home? Determined to uncover the mystery, we forced open the door. Inside, we found old, dust-covered furniture, a few discarded trunks, and, most unsettling of all, a locked drawer containing a wedding ring and an old leather-bound journal. My heart pounded as I flipped through the brittle pages, but most of the writing had faded. Only the last entry was somewhat legible. He watches. He waits. The nights are never safe. As time passed, I felt an unmistakable presence in the house. I would often wake up in the middle of the night, feeling an unseen gaze fixed on me. First, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. But then the dreams began. Each night, I would wake drenched in sweat, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread but unable to recall what had terrified me. Sometimes, I found my clothes slightly disheveled, as if I had moved in my sleep, or worse, as if something had moved them for me. Daniel dismissed my concerns, attributing my restlessness to stress. But Scott, our close friend who had always been sensitive to the paranormal, believed otherwise. "There's something in this house," he told me after spending a single night in the guest room, "and it doesn't want you here." One night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I suddenly felt the room grow icy cold. A deep, suffocating heaviness settled over my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then, I heard it, the slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the bed. I tried to reach for Daniel, but my body felt paralyzed. The blankets were yanked down as an invisible force pinned me to the bed. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The only thing I could hear was a deep, raspy whisper, but I couldn't understand the words. And then darkness. When I woke, the sun was streaming through the window. My arms were covered in faint scratches, and my nightgown was askew, as if I had struggled in my sleep. I gasped, shaking Daniel awake. "Something happened last night," I cried. "I felt it. It was here." But he didn't believe me, no matter how much I insisted. He dismissed my fear as just a nightmare. His refusal to acknowledge the truth left me feeling utterly alone. Desperate for answers, I turned to Scott and his wife, Emily, who had experience with the supernatural. Together, they dug into the history of Blackwood Manor, and what they found chilled me to the core. The house had once belonged to the Hastings family, wealthy landowners in the 1800s. But during the final days of the Civil War, a terrible tragedy unfolded on the property. For deserters from the war had sought refuge in the house during a snowstorm. When the Hastings family refused to shelter them, the deserters turned violent. The Hastings' youngest son, Edwin, betrayed his own family, helping the men murder his father. When his mother, Anna Hastings, tried to escape, she was captured and locked in the basement. The house servants fled for their lives, leaving Edwin alone with the deserters. But his alliance was short-lived. The men turned on him, and in the chaos, the house was set ablaze. By morning, only charred ruins remained. The most disturbing part? Locals whispered that Edwin's spirit never left. Scott's psychic friend, Lee, agreed to conduct an investigation. As she stepped inside the house, her face paled. "There are two spirits here," she whispered. "One is trying to protect you, but the other wants to hurt you." Determined to rid myself of the entity, Scott and Lee conducted a cleansing ritual. As they chanted, the air grew thick with static, and then the lights flickered wildly. A loud bang echoed through the house as the temperature plummeted. A dark, shadowy figure manifested at the top of the staircase. A young man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. "You cannot make me leave." The air crackled with energy, and suddenly, Lee let out a scream, clutching her throat. Scott stepped forward, holding a vial of blessed water. "You have no power here anymore," he shouted, tossing the water toward the figure. A deafening shriek filled the air as the shadow writhed in agony. Then silence. The temperature returned to normal. The heavy presence was gone. But the house, it never felt truly empty. Daniel and I sold Blackwood Manor at a loss. I didn't care about the money, I just wanted to be free. But something inside me had already changed. Our relationship was never the same. We drifted apart. Mere strangers living under the same roof. The new owner knew the history yet moved in anyway. To this day, I wonder if he, too, has heard the whispers in the night, or if he has felt the cold grip of unseen hands. Because some spirits don't rest. They linger, they wait, and sometimes they find new prey. The Curse of Nightshade Pass. It was last autumn when my two friends, Rachel and Thomas, and I decided to take a road trip to explore places rumored to be haunted. This time, we had set our sights on Nightshade Pass, a winding mountain road deep in the forests of Black Hollow, West Virginia. Locals spoke of horrifying legends surrounding the area, whispered tales of witches, cult rituals, and eerie disappearances. But the most chilling story was that of a shadowy creature that many travelers had claimed to see. Something inhuman, low to the ground, moving like it didn't belong to this world. Thomas, always the thrill seeker, had been eager to explore the place for years. Rachel, on the other hand, had been reluctant. I wasn't particularly a believer in the supernatural, but there was something about this place that intrigued me. After much convincing, Rachel finally agreed to come along. We packed our bags, loaded the car, and left for Nightshade Pass at around 2 p.m., hoping to reach the location before sunset and leave before midnight. If only we had stuck to that plan. We arrived at Nightshade Pass at exactly 4 p.m., just as the sun began to dip below the tree line. The deeper we drove into the winding forest roads, the more we began to notice something unsettling. The air inside the car grew thick and suffocating, pressing against our chests like an invisible weight. Nobody spoke, but we all felt it. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat. Is it just me? Or is it hard to breathe in here? I swallowed the growing discomfort in my throat. Maybe it's the altitude change? Thomas, who had been energetic just an hour ago, now had a deep frown on his face, rubbing his temples as if trying to fight off a headache. I feel dizzy, he muttered, like something's pressing on my skull. At that moment, I realized I wasn't feeling so well either. A dull nausea churned in my stomach, making me feel as if I had eaten something rotten. Rachel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly let out a sharp gasp and clutched her head. "What the hell is wrong with this place?" she whispered. The temperature dropped sharply, and an eerie silence settled in. There were no birds chirping, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects, only the low, constant hum of the car engine. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath. After driving further up the pass, we spotted an overgrown trail leading off the main road. It wasn't marked on any map, but it was there, hidden beneath the thick canopy of trees, nearly swallowed by nature itself. Curiosity got the better of us. We pulled over, leaving the car on the side of the road, and ventured up the path on foot. As we walked, an overwhelming feeling of being watched settled over us. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, but the tension in the air was undeniable. The forest around us grew unnaturally still, no wind, no movement, no life. It was as if the world itself had paused. Rachel hesitated, glancing back toward the car. "I don't like this. I think we should go back." Thomas scoffed. "Come on, we just got here." We continued, despite the unease clawing at our nerves. Then, after nearly an hour of hiking, we stumbled into a clearing, and what we saw made my blood run cold. In the middle of the clearing, a circle of wooden stakes stood eerily against the darkening sky. Upon each stake, a tattered white hood was nailed in place, forming a macabre ring around the center of the clearing. At the heart of the circle was a pit of scorched earth, filled with ashes, charred wood, and something unrecognizable. The air was heavy, charged with something unnatural. A suffocating pressure bore down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. "We shouldn't be here," Rachel murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is wrong." I couldn't agree more. Thomas, who had been the most eager to explore, suddenly looked uneasy. "Let's go. Now." No one argued. We turned and left as quickly as we could. But as we made our way back down the path, I couldn't shake the suffocating sensation of something following us. Rachel was the first to break into a sprint, bolting toward the car and peeling away without us. That left me and Thomas alone in the woods, the daylight now fading fast. We hurried down the trail, but with each step, the feeling of being pursued grew stronger. Then we heard it, the sound of footsteps behind us. But when we turned around, there was nothing there. We picked up our pace, but the footsteps quickened too. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shape low to the ground, crawling unnaturally fast through the undergrowth. First, I thought it was an animal, but then it moved. It was too smooth, too deliberate, too unnatural. The thing dragged itself forward on elongated limbs, its body too thin, too distorted, like something that had been stretched and broken. I grabbed Thomas's arm. "Run!" We ran. We burst onto the main road, lungs burning, legs aching, just as we thought we were safe. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness. Rachel's car. The moment the headlights illuminated the trail, the creature flinched and then it vanished. It didn't run. It didn't fade. It simply disappeared, as if the light had erased it. We ran to the car, nearly throwing ourselves inside. When we looked back, there was nothing but empty road, but the air still felt wrong, as if something was still watching us. We never spoke about what happened that night. Rachel refused to acknowledge it. Within 2 days, we all lost contact with each other. Thomas became distant, avoiding any mention of Nightshade Pass, but I couldn't let it go. For weeks, I researched the history of the area, and what I found left me shaken. Others had seen the same thing. Others had felt the same dread. Some had even gone missing. I don't know what lurks in Nightshade Pass, but I do know this: it doesn't want to be found. And if you ever find yourself on that cursed road, leave before night falls, because once it sees you, you'll never escape its gaze. Thank you for spending your time with us tonight, exploring these mysterious and spine-chilling stories. If these tales have sparked your curiosity or left you with unforgettable feelings, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've had similar paranormal experiences that you'd like to share, feel free to send your story to the email address provided in the description. Who knows? Your story might become part of our journey into the spiritual world in a future episode. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our haunting tales. See you in the next episode, and remember, always keep a light by your side.